Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the mysterious world of why did the Salem witch trials become the darkest chapter in American history? A tale of power, betrayal, and hidden truths. Some stories make you question how far humans will go for pride or survival. This is one of them. So dim the lights, take a breath. And if calm yet dark history fascinates you, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. Let's travel back in time. Long, long ago, in a land far removed from the bustling metropolises we know today, there existed a world steeped in superstition, fear, and an unshakable belief in the divine and the diabolical. This was a time when reason often bowed before the unknown, and shadows whispered tales that could shatter lives. Our story, though rooted in a specific historical event, will unfold like an ancient legend, weaving together the threads of human nature, power, and the terrifying consequences of unchecked fear. Imagine a kingdom, not unlike those depicted in old tapestries, ruled by a monarch whose word was law, a king named Thuron. He was a man of stern visage, with eyes that held the weight of his lineage, and a crown that often felt heavier than any stone. His court was a place of elaborate rituals and whispered intrigues, where nobles vied for his favor. There lives a constant dance on the precipice of his pleasure or displeasure. The common folk, the peasants toiling in the fields and craftsmen working in dusty workshops, lived under a different kind of rule, the rigid doctrines of the church and the ever-present shadow of famine and disease. In this kingdom, laws were not always written with justice in mind, but often with the convenience of those in power. One such law, born from an ancient fear of the unseen, declared that any who dabbled in witchcraft, or even bore its mark, would face the gravest punishment imaginable. It was a law rarely invoked, mostly a chilling reminder of the kingdom's darker edges, but its presence was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of daily life. The story truly begins not in the grand halls of King Thuron, but in a small, isolated village nestled deep within the kingdom's sprawling forests. This village, known as Eldoria, was a place of simple, devout folk who clung to their traditions and feared God with an intensity that bordered on terror. Their lives were hard, marked by the unforgiving cycle of the seasons, and their greatest comfort lay in their shared faith and tight-knit community. But even in Eldoria, peace was a fragile thing. A new, zealous preacher, Reverend Silas, had recently arrived, his sermons thundering with warnings of the devil's insidious grasp and the need for constant vigilance against sin. He was a man consumed by righteous fervor, his eyes alight with a conviction that brooked no dissent. His words, delivered with passionate intensity, began to sow seeds of suspicion among the villagers, turning neighbor against neighbor with the subtle poison of doubt. It started innocently enough, with a few unusual occurrences. A cow fell ill without explanation, a child suffered from strange fits, and a harvest, usually bountiful, yielded less than expected. In a world without scientific understanding, these misfortunes were easily attributed to malevolent forces. And Reverend Silas, with his fiery sermons, was quick to point fingers, not directly, but with implications that resonated deeply in the fearful hearts of the villagers. A young woman named Elara, known for her independent spirit and her unusual knowledge of herbs and natural remedies, became an early target. She was a healer, often sought out by those who distrusted the crude methods of the local physician. Her quiet demeanor and her preference for solitude made her an easy subject for whispered rumors. People started to recall her walking through the woods at dusk, gathering strange plants, and her eyes, often lost in thought, seemed to hold a certain knowing. One frigid winter evening, a group of young girls from Eldoria, including the Reverend's own daughter, Bethany, and her friends, began to exhibit peculiar behaviors. They would fall into uncontrollable fits, babbling incoherently, writhing on the ground, and claiming to see spectral figures tormenting them. Their cries were piercing, their contortions terrifying to witness. The village doctor, a man named Master Godfrey, could find no physical ailment, no fever, no visible injury. The fear in Eldoria escalated. Reverend Salas, his face grim with what he believed was divine purpose, declared that the devil had surely infiltrated their righteous community. He preached that these girls were suffering under the grip of witchcraft, and that the witches themselves walked among them, hidden in plain sight. The villagers, already primed by his sermons and their own innate fears, readily accepted this explanation. The girls, seemingly encouraged by the attention and perhaps by an unconscious desire for drama, began to point fingers. Their accusations, delivered during their fits or in moments of apparent lucidity, were chilling. Their first target, Ilara. They claimed to see her specter tormenting them, pinching them, whispering temptations into their ears. The accusation against Ilara sent a shockwave through the village. Many had harbored secret suspicions. Others were simply too afraid to speak against the tide of collective panic. A few, like old Thomas, a retired farmer who had known Ilara since she was a child, tried to voice their doubts, reminding everyone of Ilara's kindness and her healing touch. But his words were quickly drowned out by the rising crescendo of fear and righteous indignation. Ilara was apprehended, dragged from her small cottage by a nervous but determined group of villagers. Her hands were bound, her calm gaze unwavering even as the accusations rained down upon her. She was brought before the village elders, a council led by the austere and increasingly self-important Deacon Bartholomew, a man who saw this as an opportunity to solidify his own influence. The interrogation was a cruel farce. Ilara was denied proper counsel, her pleas of innocence met with scoffing and accusations of deceit. The evidence presented against her was flimsy at best. Her knowledge of herbs, her solitary nature, and most damningly, the frantic testimony of the afflicted girls. They would shriek and fall into fits whenever Ilara was brought into their presence, their performances convincing enough to seal her fate in the eyes of the fearful community. Under the harsh glare of oil lamps, Ilara was subjected to methods designed to extract confessions. She was deprived of sleep, fed sparingly, and questioned relentlessly for days. The weight of false accusation, the terror of her situation, and the relentless pressure began to wear her down. Yet she refused to confess to something she had not done, maintaining her innocence with a quiet dignity that only seemed to infuriate her accusers further. Deacon Bartholomew, eager to demonstrate his piety and uphold the strict laws of the kingdom, pressed for a trial. News of Eldoria's witchcraft outbreak eventually reached the ears of King Thuron's court, albeit in a distorted, sensationalized manner. The king, busy with affairs of state and far removed from the daily lives of his remote villagers, initially dismissed it as a provincial folly. However, his ambitious and cunning Lord Chancellor, a man named Valerius, saw an opportunity. Valerius was a master manipulator, always seeking to expand his own power and influence. He advised the king that ignoring such an outbreak of devilry could be seen as weakness, and that a swift, decisive response would demonstrate the crown's unwavering commitment to faith and order. He suggested sending a royal judge, a stern hand to bring justice to Eldoria, conveniently choosing a judge known to be pliable to his suggestions. Thus, Judge Alaric, a man with a reputation for severity and an unshakable belief in the literal interpretation of ancient laws, was dispatched to Eldoria. His arrival was a grand affair, a procession of armed guards and clerks, bringing a semblance of royal authority to the small, terrified village. This raised the stakes considerably, transforming a local hysteria into a matter of state. The trial of Alara began in earnest. The courtroom was a makeshift hall, filled with anxious villagers, their eyes wide with morbid curiosity and fear. Judge Alaric presided with an air of unyielding authority, his face a mask of stern judgment. The afflicted girls were brought forth, and their dramatic performances continued, their screams echoing through the hall, each one a nail in Alara's coffin. One particularly cruel method of examination was employed, the touch test. Alara was made to touch the afflicted girls. If they ceased their fits upon her touch, it was seen as proof that her spectral torment had withdrawn, thus confirming her guilt. Of course, the girls, coached or influenced by the escalating drama, would invariably calm down, only to collapse again once Alara withdrew her hand, further cementing the villagers' belief in her diabolical powers. Alara, exhausted and demoralized, could only watch as the proceedings spiraled beyond her control. Her gentle demeanor, her refusal to break down, was twisted by her accusers into a sign of her unnatural resilience, a mark of the devil's protection. The more she asserted her innocence, the more determined they became to prove her guilt. Old Thomas, the retired farmer, tried again to speak in Alara's defense. He bravely stepped forward, attempting to recount instances of Alara's kindness, her cures, her gentle nature. But Judge Alaric silenced him with a bang of his gavel, declaring that such anecdotal evidence was irrelevant in the face of the demonic torment suffered by the girls. Thomas was warned that further interruption would result in his own imprisonment for obstructing justice. The verdict was inevitable. After what was barely a pretense of a fair trial, Alara was found guilty of witchcraft. The sentence was swift and brutal, death by hanging. The village, initially shocked by the pronouncement, soon gave way to a mixture of grim satisfaction and renewed fear. They believed they had purged a great evil from their midst. The day of Alara's execution was a somber one. The entire village gathered, a silent, grim procession watching as she was led to the gallows erected on the village green. As she stood before them, her hands bound, her eyes scanned the crowd, perhaps searching for a glimmer of understanding, a single face that doubted her guilt. But she found mostly fear, suspicion, and a chilling sense of morbid certainty. Before the noose was placed around her neck, Alara spoke, her voice clear and surprisingly strong. She declared her innocence one final time, not with anger but with a deep sadness. She spoke of the injustice, of the fear that had consumed them, and warned that fear, once unleashed, rarely stopped with one victim. Then, with a quiet dignity, she met her fate. The silence that followed her death was deafening, a heavy blanket of unspoken guilt and profound unease. But Alara's death did not bring peace to Eldoria. Instead, it ignited a far more terrifying fire. The afflicted girls, perhaps emboldened by their success, continued their fits. And their accusations, once limited to Alara, began to spread like a contagion. Soon other villagers were accused. Martha, a grumpy old woman who lived on the outskirts of the village and was known for her sharp tongue, was an easy target. Then came John, a prosperous landowner who had recently had a dispute with Deacon Bartholomew over a piece of land. The accusations became less about specific acts of witchcraft and more about settling old grudges, silencing inconvenient voices, or simply deflecting suspicion from oneself. The atmosphere in Eldoria became one of pervasive paranoia. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion, families were torn apart by accusations, and anyone who dared to question the proceedings risked becoming a target themselves. Reverend Salas, his initial fervor now tinged with a desperate attempt to maintain control, continued to preach sermons filled with fire and brimstone, inadvertently fanning the flames of hysteria. Judge Alaric, enjoying the expanded authority and the validation from Lord Chancellor Valerius, established a special court in Eldoria to handle the surge of new cases. The trials became even more perfunctory, the evidence even flimsier. Dreams were taken as proof, spectral torment was universally accepted, and any mark on the body, from a mole to a scar, could be interpreted as a witch's mark. The cruelty intensified. Torture, though officially frowned upon by the king's direct laws, was discreetly employed to extract confessions. Suspects were subjected to sleep deprivation, forced confessions through psychological torment, and in some cases, the terrifying swimming test, where accused witches were thrown into water. If they floated, they were guilty. If they sank and drowned, they were innocent but dead nonetheless. One particularly agonizing method involved pressing. An elderly man named Samuel, accused solely because his wife had argued with one of the accusers, refused to confess. He was laid on the ground and heavy stones were placed upon his chest, gradually increasing in weight until he was crushed to death, still refusing to utter a false confession. His defiant silence, even in the face of such unimaginable pain, shook some of the villagers to their core, a testament to the raw injustice unfolding. The abuse of power became flagrant. Deacon Bartholomew and Judge Alaric, now virtually unchallenged, used the witch trials to consolidate their influence. Properties of the condemned were confiscated, often enriching those in power. Personal vendettas were settled under the guise of rooting out evil. The kingdom's old law against witchcraft, originally intended as a deterrent against genuine dark practices, became a weapon in the hands of the ambitious and the fearful. King Thuron, far away in his magnificent castle, remained largely unaware of the extent of the suffering in Eldoria. Lord Chancellor Valerius skillfully filtered the information, presenting the trials as a necessary cleansing, a vital step in maintaining the kingdom's moral purity. He even hinted that some of the accused were indeed rebels or conspirators against the crown, further justifying the harsh measures in the king's eyes. However, whispers of the escalating brutality eventually began to reach other parts of the kingdom. Merchants traveling through Eldoria carried tales of the madness, of innocent people being condemned on the flimsiest of evidence. Some brave souls, scholars and learned men from the kingdom's few universities, began to voice their concerns, questioning the legal procedures and the nature of the evidence. Among these dissenting voices was Professor Elias, a respected scholar of ancient texts and law. He wrote a treatise, circulating it secretly among the educated elite, arguing that the Eldoria trials were a perversion of justice, driven by hysteria and lacking any true legal basis. He highlighted the absurdity of spectral evidence and the barbarity of the torturous interrogations. His words, though initially dismissed by Valerius and his allies as the ramblings of an ivory tower academic, began to gain traction, especially among those nobles who were growing uneasy with the Lord Chancellor's increasing power. They saw Valerius using the witch trials not just to root out evil, but to remove his political opponents and enrich himself. The turning point came when the accusations began to reach higher up the social ladder. No longer content with merely condemning peasants and outcasts, the afflicted girls, perhaps driven by a combination of genuine delusion and a thirst for continued notoriety, started to accuse respected members of the community, even the wife of a powerful nobleman, Lady Eleanor, a woman known for her piety and charitable works. This accusation was a bridge too far. Lady Eleanor's husband, Lord Reginald, a man of considerable influence and close ties to the king, was outraged. He immediately appealed directly to King Thuron, bypassing Valerius entirely. Lord Reginald, unlike the common villagers, had the means and the standing to demand a fair hearing, and he laid bare the full horror of the Eldoria trials. The spectral evidence, the torture, the dubious confessions, and the blatant abuses of power. King Thuron, who had been receiving sanitized reports, was finally confronted with the grim reality. He was a king who, despite his sternness, genuinely believed in justice, however imperfectly applied. The idea that his royal justice was being perverted, that innocent subjects were being murdered under the banner of his law, deeply disturbed him. And the thought of a loyal nobleman's wife being unjustly accused spurred him to action. He dispatched a special royal commission, comprised of trusted, independent judges and scholars, including Professor Elias, to Eldoria. Their mandate was clear: investigate the trials thoroughly, review all evidence, and bring an end to the madness if found justified. This time, Valerius could not interfere. The arrival of the royal commission in Eldoria was met with a mixture of relief and fear. Reverend Silas and Deacon Bartholomew, who had wielded so much power, suddenly found themselves on the defensive, their authority crumbling. Judge Alaric, confident in his own righteousness, initially resisted, but the king's direct order left him no choice but to cooperate. The commission began its work methodically. They listened to the testimonies of the accused who still lived. They re-examined the evidence. And most importantly, they questioned the afflicted girls with a critical eye, free from the previous atmosphere of fear and unquestioning belief. Under the scrutiny of the royal commission, the girls' stories began to unravel. Their performances, once so convincing, now appeared theatrical and inconsistent. When pressed with logical questions, their accusations faltered, and their spectral tormentors became less vivid. Some of the girls, exhausted by the charade and perhaps feeling the weight of their actions, began to recant, admitting that they had fabricated some of their claims, initially out of fear, then for attention. The commission's findings were damning. They exposed the systemic flaws in the trials, the reliance on spectral evidence, the use of torture, the lack of due process, and the clear instances of personal vendettas masquerading as righteous judgments. They also uncovered the financial improprieties, the way properties of the condemned had been seized and distributed among those in power. Judge Alaric was stripped of his authority and recalled to the capital to face charges of malfeasance and abuse of power. Deacon Bartholomew was removed from his position and imprisoned for his role in the injustice. Reverend Silas, his reputation in tatters, was censured and exiled from the kingdom. his fervent faith having led to a terrible perversion of justice. The remaining accused witches were released, many of them having endured months of torment and imprisonment. Their lives were forever scarred, their reputations irrevocably damaged, but at least their lives were spared. The village of Eldoria was left reeling, a community shattered by fear, suspicion, and the memory of unimaginable cruelty. King Thuron, upon receiving the full report from the Royal Commission, was filled with a deep sense of regret and shame. He issued a royal proclamation, condemning the Eldoria trials, acknowledging the grave injustices committed, and offering pardons and meager restitutions to the victims and their families. He also decreed new laws, stricter regulations for trials, explicitly banning spectral evidence and all forms of torture, ensuring that such a travesty could never happen again under his reign. Lord Chancellor Valerius, whose machinations had allowed the nightmare to persist for so long, faced a subtle but irreversible downfall. Though he avoided direct punishment due to his cunning and high standing, the king's trust in him was broken. His influence waned, his power diminished, and he gradually faded from the inner circle of the king's advisors, a silent testament to the king's displeasure. The tale of Eldoria became a grim lesson, whispered across the kingdom for generations. It taught that fear, when allowed to fester, can turn good people into monsters. It showed how easily power can be abused, how laws meant to uphold order can be twisted into instruments of tyranny. It highlighted the fragility of justice and the importance of reason in the face of hysteria. The moral of this dark chapter was clear. A society that allows itself to be consumed by irrational fear, that permits its laws to be bent by personal prejudice and ambition, and that silences dissenting voices, is a society on the precipice of its own destruction. True justice demands fairness, empathy, and an unwavering commitment to truth, even when the truth is inconvenient or frightening. Without these, even the most devout and well-intentioned communities can become the architects of their own darkest chapters. And so, the echoes of Eldoria served as a chilling reminder that vigilance against the shadows of human nature is an eternal struggle. The scars on the land of Eldoria, however, ran deep. The fields, once tended with communal spirit, now seemed to bear a silent sorrow. Families remained fractured, trust had been shattered beyond repair, and the once vibrant community spirit was replaced by an undercurrent of melancholic quietude. Children, who had witnessed the public accusations and the terror in their parents' eyes, grew up with a deep-seated caution, an almost instinctive distrust of authority and fervent beliefs. Even the natural world seemed to reflect the village's trauma. The ancient trees surrounding Eldoria, which had stood as silent sentinels during the horrific events, now seemed to cast longer, darker shadows, their branches rustling with what sounded like whispered warnings. The clear stream that flowed through the village, once a symbol of purity, now seemed to carry with it the faint, lingering echo of desperate cries. Those who had been falsely accused and miraculously survived carried an invisible burden. Their eyes held a profound sadness, a knowledge of human cruelty that could never be unlearned. They had seen the darkest corners of human nature, had felt the full weight of collective delusion, and though they were free, they were forever changed. Some moved away, seeking solace in anonymity, hopping to escape the haunting memories and the lingering suspicion that, despite the king's proclamation, still clung to their names in the minds of some. Others remained, living out their days in quiet resilience, their presence a living testament to the atrocities they had endured. The young girls who had been the initial accusers, particularly Bethany, Reverend Silas's daughter, faced their own complicated futures. While some had genuinely believed in their tormentors, others had consciously fabricated or exaggerated their claims, swept up in the drama and the attention. With the Royal Commission's findings, their status shifted from victims to perpetrators of a terrible deception. They were not subjected to the same harsh punishments as the adult accusers, given their youth, but they lived with the shame and the societal condemnation that followed. Bethany, once the center of village attention, retreated into herself, a shadow of her former self, forever marked by the part she had played in the tragedy. Her father's exile and her own guilt weighed heavily upon her, leaving her with a lifetime of regret and a profound understanding of the power of a lie. Professor Elias, the scholar who had bravely spoken out, continued his work, not just within the confines of academia, but actively advising the king on legal reforms. He dedicated his life to ensuring that the kingdom's laws were based on reason, evidence, and genuine justice, rather than superstition or fear. His influence helped shape a new era of legal thought, laying the groundwork for more equitable legal practices throughout the kingdom. He often spoke of Eldoria, not as a point of shame to be hidden, but as a stark warning, a vital lesson etched into the fabric of their history. King Thuron, haunted by the realization of his initial oversight, became a more vigilant ruler. The Eldoria trials served as a humbling experience, forcing him to confront the limitations of his own remote authority and the potential for corruption, even within his trusted circles. He established a system of independent royal oversight for all major legal proceedings in the more remote provinces, ensuring that no local magistrate or preacher could again wield unchecked power to such devastating effect. His later years were marked by a quiet determination to right the wrongs of the past and to strengthen the foundations of justice in his kingdom. He often reflected on Alara's final words, her warning about fear, and understood the profound truth in them. The story of Eldoria, though a specific event in a particular time and place, resonated far beyond the kingdom's borders and across the centuries. It became a timeless allegory, a stark reminder of the dangers inherent in mass hysteria, in the demonization of difference, and in the unchecked abuse of power. It taught generations to come that the greatest darkness often arises not from mythical beasts or external threats, but from within the human heart itself, when fear triumphs over reason and prejudice over compassion. The memory of the Salem witch trials, as it would be known in later annals, served as a foundational cautionary tale, influencing the development of legal systems and societal norms. It underscored the absolute necessity of due process, the presumption of innocence, and the critical importance of separating church and state in matters of legal judgment. It taught that when a society allows religious fervor or popular opinion to dictate legal outcomes, the very fabric of justice unravels, leaving behind a trail of irreversible devastation. The lessons gleaned from this dark chapter were not easily forgotten. They whispered through the ages, reminding future generations that vigilance is paramount. Vigilance against the demagogues who exploit fear for personal gain, against the silent majority who allow injustice to fester through inaction, and most importantly, against the insidious creep of prejudice that can transform neighbors into accusers and doubt into damning evidence. And so, the tale of Eldoria, of King Thuron's realm, and the suffering inflicted upon its innocent people, continued to echo, a profound and somber note in the grand symphony of human history. It was a story not just of cruelty and injustice, but also of resilience, of the eventual triumph of reason, and the enduring hope that humanity, though capable of immense darkness, is also capable of learning from its gravest mistakes, striving always for a brighter, more just future. The quiet lesson, therefore, remained: to never forget the cost of fear, and to always defend the light of truth and compassion against the encroaching shadows. The quiet lesson, therefore, remained: to never forget the cost of fear, and to always defend the light of truth and compassion against the encroaching shadows. It was a lesson painstakingly learned, carved into the collective memory of the kingdom, and though the immediate pain of Eldoria slowly faded with the passage of time, the wisdom it imparted endured, becoming an integral part of the societal consciousness. The generations that followed, while not personally witnessing the terror, inherited the responsibility to remember, to understand, and to prevent such darkness from ever taking root again. Artists would later capture the somber mood of Eldoria in their works, depicting the accused with stoic dignity, and the accusers with eyes wide with misplaced conviction. Poets would write elegies for the lost, their verses lamenting the blindness of humanity and celebrating the courage of those who stood firm against the tide of hysteria. These artistic expressions served as a continuous reminder, ensuring that the human cost of the trials was never reduced to mere statistics or abstract historical facts. Philosophers, too, delved into the Eldoria narrative, dissecting the psychological mechanisms behind mass delusion, the societal pressures that lead to conformity, and the terrifying ease with which individuals can relinquish their critical faculties when gripped by collective anxiety. They explored the complex interplay of religious belief, political ambition, and basic human fear, concluding that no society, no matter how enlightened or devout, is entirely immune to such phenomena. It was a constant challenge, they argued, for humanity to remain anchored in reason and empathy, especially during times of uncertainty or crisis. The reforms enacted by King Thuron, inspired by Professor Elias, became benchmarks for justice throughout the realm. The principle of innocent until proven guilty, once a fragile concept, gained unprecedented strength. The separation of spiritual accusations from legal judgments became more pronounced, creating a clearer demarcation between matters of faith and matters of law. No longer could a mere accusation of spectral torment or a perceived witch's mark be sufficient to condemn an individual to death. Tangible evidence, credible witnesses free from coercion, and impartial judges became the cornerstones of the new legal system. Even the role of the clergy in legal affairs saw significant revision. While spiritual guidance remained vital to the kingdom, the direct involvement of preachers and religious figures in judicial proceedings was curtailed. The Eldoria episode had starkly illustrated how easily spiritual authority, when intertwined with legal power, could be corrupted and lead to immense suffering. This institutional separation aimed to protect both the integrity of the law and the sanctity of faith itself from being exploited for temporal power or personal vendettas. The villagers of Eldoria, despite their trauma, slowly began the arduous process of rebuilding, not just their physical structures, but their fractured community. It was a testament to the human spirit's resilience. They established new customs, new ways of interacting, designed to foster trust and mutual support. Old grudges, though not entirely forgotten, were overshadowed by a shared understanding of their collective past, and a quiet determination to forge a more compassionate future. They learned to speak out, to question, and to stand up for one another, having experienced firsthand the devastating consequences of silence and conformity. The descendants of those who suffered, and even those of the accusers, carried the legacy forward. It was a heavy inheritance, but one that brought with it a profound sense of responsibility. They understood that the past was not merely a collection of bygone events, but a living lesson, a constant whisper from history urging them to remain vigilant, to champion justice, and to extend empathy to those who were different or misunderstood. They knew that the shadow of Eldoria, though long, could be kept at bay by the unwavering light of compassion and reason. And as centuries turned into millennia, the story transformed from a specific historical event into a universal myth, a cautionary tale told and retold in countless variations across diverse cultures. It became a symbol of humanity's ongoing struggle against ignorance, fear, and the darker impulses that lurk within the collective psyche. The Salem witch trials, the name it ultimately acquired in the annals of history, stood as a stark monument to a time when fear twisted perceptions, turned justice on its head, and left an indelible stain on the human record. It was a chapter that taught, with brutal clarity, that the darkest passages in any history are often written not by external enemies, but by the internal demons of prejudice and unchecked power. And the enduring lesson, breathed softly through the ages, was this: never again. Never again allow fear to extinguish the light of truth. Never again allow silence to become complicity. Never again allow the innocent to suffer for the delusions of the many. This profound moral, woven into the very fabric of their memory, served as a guiding star, urging humanity toward a future where justice, understanding, and empathy would always prevail over the chilling whispers of fear. This profound moral, woven into the very fabric of their memory, served as a guiding star, urging humanity toward a future where justice, understanding, and empathy would always prevail over the chilling whispers of fear. The echoes of Eldoria, though distant, remained a part of the collective human experience, a testament to both the depths of human cruelty and the enduring capacity for redemption and growth. The advancements in scientific thought, which slowly but surely began to emerge in the centuries following the Eldoria tragedy, further cemented the understanding of what had transpired. As knowledge expanded, explaining illnesses previously attributed to supernatural forces and demonstrating the power of suggestion and mass psychology, the true nature of the events became even clearer. The afflictions of the young girls were later understood through lenses of hysteria, social influence, and perhaps even early forms of Munchausen syndrome, rather than demonic possession. This scientific clarity reinforced the earlier lessons about the dangers of ignorance and the imperative to seek empirical truth over superstitious belief. Educational institutions throughout the kingdom, and eventually across the world, incorporated the story of the Salem witch trials into their curricula. It became a mandatory study, not just as a historical event, but as a critical examination of societal vulnerabilities. Students learned about the slippery slope from fear to fanaticism, the erosion of individual rights in times of panic, and the courage it takes to stand as a dissenting voice against a roaring mob. The detailed accounts, meticulously preserved by Professor Elias and his successors, served as invaluable primary sources for this ongoing educational mission. In Eldoria itself, a quiet memorial was eventually erected, a simple stone obelisk bearing the names of those who had been unjustly condemned and executed. It wasn't a grand monument, but a humble marker placed in the center of the old village green, where the gallows once stood. It served not as a symbol of triumph, but as a perpetual reminder of loss, a solemn space for reflection and remembrance. On certain anniversaries, the descendants of the victims and, remarkably, even some of the descendants of the accusers would gather there in silent vigil, a poignant act of shared remembrance and a collective vow to prevent history from repeating itself. The concept of individual liberty and the protection of civil rights, though nascent in King Thuron's era, found strong impetus in the aftermath of Eldoria. The trials highlighted the immense power of the state over the individual and the ease with which that power could be abused. This understanding gradually led to the development of legal frameworks designed to safeguard individual freedoms, ensuring that no person could be condemned without irrefutable evidence and fair process. The rights to legal representation, to confront accusers, and to a trial by an impartial jury, which we often take for granted today, were painstakingly forged in the crucible of such historical injustices. Even the role of the media, in its earliest forms of printed pamphlets and public pronouncements, was scrutinized. The sensationalized stories and biased reports that had fueled the initial hysteria were recognized as having contributed to the tragedy. This realization sparked early discussions about the responsibility of those who disseminate information, the need for accuracy, and the potential for propaganda to manipulate public opinion. It was a slow evolution, but the seeds of journalistic ethics and the importance of objective reporting were undeniably sown in the aftermath of such events. The memory of Eldoria also impacted the broader theological discourse within the kingdom. The unquestioning acceptance of a literal, omnipresent devil influencing every misfortune began to be tempered with a more nuanced understanding of human evil and psychological distress. While faith remained a cornerstone of society, the church itself, chastened by the Eldoria experience, began to emphasize compassion, forgiveness, and critical discernment over fear-mongering and rigid dogma. It was a long and challenging journey, but the spiritual landscape of the kingdom gradually shifted, becoming more attuned to the inherent dignity and rights of every individual. And so, the legacy of this dark chapter continued to unfold, not as a closed book, but as an open lesson, constantly evolving and reshaping the trajectory of human civilization. It served as a perpetual challenge to every generation, to question, to empathize, to seek truth, and to uphold justice against all odds. The whisper from Eldoria, carried on the winds of time, reminded everyone that the darkest chapters are not merely historical footnotes, but vital warnings, forever urging humanity to strive for a world where such injustices could never again cast their long, terrifying shadows. The journey was endless, the struggle perpetual, but the moral compass, once tragically lost, was now firmly set, guided by the indelible lessons of a past that demanded to be remembered, understood, and ultimately transcended. The human spirit, though capable of such profound cruelty, also harbored an unbreakable will to learn, to grow, and to continually strive for a future bathed in the unwavering light of compassion and reason. This was the ultimate, enduring testament of Eldoria. This was the ultimate, enduring testament of Eldoria. Its story, a tapestry woven with threads of terror and resilience, ambition and redemption, fear and enlightenment, continued to serve as a silent mentor to all who dared to listen. It taught that the true measure of a civilization lies not in its grand monuments or its military might, but in its unwavering commitment to justice for every soul, in its capacity for empathy, and in its relentless pursuit of truth. The kings and queens who followed King Thuron often revisited the archives detailing the Eldoria trials, not for entertainment, but as a sober reminder of the profound responsibilities that came with power. They understood that the crown, while a symbol of authority, also carried the immense burden of protecting the most vulnerable citizens from the darkest inclinations of human nature, including those that might arise from within their own systems. The arrogance that once plagued rulers began to be tempered by a humility born from the stark lessons of the past. The common people, the descendants of the peasants and nobles alike, passed down the narrative through oral traditions and bedtime stories, albeit with less emphasis on the gruesome details and more on the moral arc. These tales, stripped of some of their historical specificity, became fables of caution, teaching children about the dangers of false accusations, the importance of speaking up, and the sacred duty to protect those who are different. The character of Alara, the innocent healer, became a figure of quiet heroism, a symbol of resilience against overwhelming injustice. Even the architecture of newer settlements reflected a subtle change. Public spaces, once dominated by strict religious iconography, began to incorporate symbols of justice and reason, subtle nods to the lessons learned. Town halls were designed with open, accessible spaces, and courts were built with clear, visible lines of sight, minimizing the secretive corners where darkness might fester. These were not mere aesthetic choices, but conscious efforts to build environments that fostered transparency and accountability, countering the cloistered, fear-driven spaces that had once allowed injustice to flourish. The ghost of Eldoria, therefore, was not one of despair, but one of profound, transformative wisdom. It whispered not of endless suffering, but of the potential for profound growth. It reminded humanity that even in the bleakest moments, the seeds of change could be sown, and from the ashes of injustice, a stronger, more compassionate society could emerge. The journey was arduous, filled with setbacks and challenges, but the path forward was illuminated by the flickering light of this hard-won understanding. And as the final embers of this ancient tale glowed softly, fading into the long night, the overarching message resonated with serene clarity. The darkest chapters in history are not meant to haunt us with eternal dread, but to serve as an eternal beacon, guiding us away from the precipice of our own making, urging us always towards the bright horizon of a more humane and just world. So, as you drift into slumber, carry this lesson with you, letting its quiet strength guard your dreams. Good night.